Case Western Reserve University's Great Thinker Series proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. These lectures are presented by the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and IdeaStream, with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. Tonight, we are pleased to be here at the Tinkham-Veal University Center on the campus of Case Western Reserve University to hear Dr. Bruce Latimer speak on modern and archaic human evolution, new discoveries from the Manot cave. Dr. Latimer is visiting professor in the Case Western Reserve University School of Dental Medicine and in the Department of Anthropology. He is a former curator of physical anthropology and director of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and is a founding fellow of the Institute for the Science of Origins. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Latimer.
It's nice to look out there and see so many familiar faces. Of course, there are people that it's No, it's great to see all of you, and some of you I haven't seen in a long time. Now, what I'm going to talk about is this cave site. Now, I'll go into it a little bit more, and why it's important. And I'll tell you right now, the reason it's important is it looks like, from everything we know, humans left Africa for the last time 60,000 years ago. But we don't have any fossil evidence of it along the Levant. The earliest human in Europe, modern human, is about 45,000. So we know we've got them in Africa at 160,000, but we don't have any fossil evidence. Now, this cave, nobody knew it existed. It wasn't until 8 years ago, that what happened then is that they were digging a sewer line in this little town of Manot, and they broke through the roof of a cave. So my colleagues rappelled down, and you'll see that, and went down there. I didn't rappel down. No way I'm going to do that. So what we did is we knocked the door in, so now that we can actually walk into the place. It's the largest cave in the Middle East. It is 7 stories deep. Now, just let me tell you, I don't know if you're claustrophobic. Elevators don't bother me, okay? They don't bother me. But when you get in those little tiny areas, yeah, I'm thinking, you know, it's lunchtime, isn't it? It's get out of here. So that's what I'm going to mostly talk about, is the cave. But I'll have a little lead in too. Now, here's what I'd like to start with. I think this should be in every natural history museum on the planet. And I think every kid from age 3 to 4 to 5 and 6 should know this. Folks, we're all African. We only left 60,000 years ago. That's not very long. And of course, you know who this is. This is everything I'm going to tell you is ultimately because of this guy and his wonderful, and his powerful ideas about human evolution, about evolution in general, organic evolution via natural selection. And what Darwin did, he didn't have any fossils. He had a couple Neanderthals, but they didn't tell him much. And it's telling that, you know what? He looked at these Neanderthals and he said, hey, they're not telling us much about human evolution. So what he did, he triangulated with what he knew through comparative anatomy. And of course, he talked about the big brain. Humans love to talk about how smart we are. Well, okay, fine, we're the smartest animals on the planet. So he talked about the brain. Then he said, you know, we walk upright. We're the only mammal that walks the way we do. So he said, maybe the big brain's connected the way we walk. And then he looked at tools and he said, we're the only ones that have tools. So he triangulated all these things and he said this. He said, here's the way I think it happened. We started walking upright, and that freed our hands. Then we started making tools because our hands are free. We didn't have to locomote with them anymore. And then what happened, you start a feedback loop with the brain, and the tools become more complex, and the brain gets bigger, and the tools are more complex, and the brain gets bigger, and pretty soon we got all these stone tools we're carrying around, don't have any pockets. Where are you going to put them? So you got to stand up and carry these things around. It didn't work like that, sorry. Darwin didn't make many mistakes. This one he did. But all he had was comparative anatomy. Now I'm showing you this because Darwin knew that guy, the common chimpanzee, is our closest relative. He knew that from anatomy. And I could actually take a body, put it on in the medical school in anatomy, and those students could use their Gray's Anatomy or the Grant's Atlas, and they wouldn't even know the difference if I shaved it. They wouldn't even know. That's how close we are to these animals. Now, underneath them, I want you to remember those numbers. You don't have to memorize them. I'm not going to test you. The point is, I was trying to figure out how am I going to organize this. So I'm not going to organize it through taxonomy. I'm not going to go through the phylogenetic trees and say, this turned into this, and that turned into that, and that turned into that. Because there are too many names, and we're not going there. We're going to organize this on the basis of brain size. Because ultimately, that's what makes us, right? Modern humans. It's our brains. Well, as I look around, yeah, right. Well, I stand corrected on some. So now we can take comparative anatomy, and it's still comparative anatomy, to the level of this stuff, to DNA. And we know these are your cousins. These are your first cousins. That's common chimpanzee, that's a pygmy chimp, or bonobos. So how close are we to them? Well, we're very close to them. We're 99% identical in our DNA to a chimp. That's very close. But yet, as I look out here, I didn't see anybody knuckle walk in here. I don't think you've got the great big canines like a chimpanzee. Maybe some of you have a lot of fur. But, and you have a bigger brain than a chimp, so there's a lot, that 1% is done. So, and if you really want to figure this out, you've got to go and you have to find the fossils. That's it. You can only take comparative anatomy so far, and we've pushed it as far as our resolution can. And then if you want to know what our ancestors walked like, what they looked like, how they behaved, what they were eating, you can only do it by finding the fossils. So I'm not really going to talk about the fossils that I normally do, which come out of this area. We'll mention it a little. What I want to say is that we will be talking about this area up there. Because if you want to get out of Africa, where are you going to go? How are you going to get out? Well, the way you're going to get out is you're going to come up here and go up the Levant. That's your only way out. Well, there is some discussion that maybe they crossed over here, but I doubt it. So let's talk about this. Now, I told you as a perfect example of how science works. I'm just going to mention this. Remember what I told you about Darwin's idea that big brains are linked in a package with upright walking and tool use? Well, that everybody expected human ancestors were going to have big brains. And they thought that was the first thing that we were going to find. And sure enough, in 1912, in a gravel pit outside of Piltdown, England, damn if they didn't find it. Now, this is the Piltdown man. You know, it's still brought up over and over again. And what somebody did is they took a human-sized brain, neurocranium, and everybody said, wow, we told you. Brain came first, told you. And then they attached it to the jaw of an orangutan. And they painted it. I'm not exaggerating here. They painted it. And you could still go to the British Museum, and it's locked in the same glass box it's always been in because no one got to touch it except the big guys. You know, Sir Arthur Keith, he could touch it, but no one else could. Because if you took your fingernail and scratched it, you'd say, somebody painted this. And whoever did it was smart enough they broke off areas that you can't connect. It's pretty smart. Well, it turns out it was a hoax, a terrible hoax. But it went on forever and ever. And Sir Arthur Keith, on his deathbed, finally said I was wrong, having written about 5 books about it. So forget that. Forget Piltdown. But it's interesting that science is self-correcting and that what they thought is that the brain came first. Well, it didn't. Now, this is just a little thing to give you an idea. We all know that chimpanzee has a brain, call it 400 cc's. Lucy, which is that. Oh, it is getting weak. Okay, well, Lucy, do I have an arrow? Oh, kind of afraid. Okay, well, starting from your left, we have Lucy, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and humans. The whole point is I'm just trying to show that the brain is actually growing, getting bigger. Well, here is the rub. In 1924, Raymond Dart found this in South Africa, in a lime works, Tong lime works, so it's called the Tong child. It has a tiny little brain. And Dart, who was a student of Keith's, Dart published this in Nature in 1925. And did he ever get hammered? They said, this isn't Piltdown. Piltdown has a big brain. We know you should have a big brain. This has a little brain. It doesn't fit the story because this has a little brain in a human-like face. Just the opposite of Piltdown. It took forever to get Piltdown out of this thing. And now we know we've got Artie. We can take it back to 4.4 million. Actually even further, but we have enough of this skeleton that we can say something about it. Artie was bipedal when on the ground, didn't walk like you and I walk. And it still has a brain essentially that of a chimpanzee. This, of course, is Lucy. I know those of you that see me talk, I can't give a talk with that showing Lucy. I can't. I love Lucy. What did Lucy tell us? Well, Lucy told us that we walked upright by 4 million years ago, essentially the way you and I walk. You wouldn't, Lucy was little, she was only this tall, and if you saw her walking across a field, you would think, it's a little kid. But when you got closer, you wouldn't, because she had an ape-sized brain. So she told us that habitual bipedality is much older. Oh my, I'm in trouble here. It's the lady holding up 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to talk very fast now. Walking upright came much before the brain. And we know that because Lucy has a birth canal that wouldn't tolerate a large brain fetus. So she walked upright and had a little brain. A little later on, we've got something called Australopithecus garhi, 2.5 million. And the brain's a little bit larger. And curiously enough, we also at this point find tools. And the beauty of it is we actually know what those tools are being used for. And the tools are being used to crack open bones to get to the marrow. Because marrow is fat, it's lipid. And you know what your brain is? Your brain is fat. It's lipid. So if you want to go, once you're born, those neurons, you're not packing them on anymore, but you're packing on glia. And so the tool was not invented necessarily by the big brain. We turned that on its head. And the tool was actually invented, well, no, the tool released the constraints on the brain. When you have more calories, you can grow it. Your brain is 2.5 pounds, not 2.5 pounds, excuse me. It's 2 to 3% of your body weight, but it utilizes 30% of your energy. It's an incredibly expensive organ. Then again, we see the brain getting even a little bit bigger in Homo habilis. And it gets a little bit bigger in Homo erectus. So what we see here is this whole thing really taking off about 1 million years ago, and the brain just essentially doubles and triples in size. That's the fastest evolutionary trajectory that I know of. But all of a sudden, at 400,000 years ago, it hit the wall. It hit the wall. It hasn't grown since. In fact, some people are saying it's getting smaller. Case in point. And the reason is we couldn't get it through the pelvis anymore. That's the problem. Ever wondered why humans have such a terrible time in birth? This is why. You have to take that large brain fetus and shove it through that. Look at Lucy. She's very wide, but front to back very shallow. Humans have to do these twists and turns and rotations and flips to get out. It's the most gymnastic thing most of you will do or have done. Even that wasn't enough. We and humans, okay, we in humans continue if we look at the brain relative to body growth, what happens is we continue the fetal growth trajectory even after birth. Look at the chimp. It doesn't. It flattens out and plateaus. We continue that. And our brain doesn't really reach its adult size until we're about 6 years old, which is incidentally when your first molar comes in. And in a chimpanzee, it tops out when its first molar comes in. In fact, all mammals top out when their first adult molar comes in. Their brain stops growing. Even that wasn't enough, that we had a fetal head we're pushing through the canal. We had to put in these things, the fontanelles. And those of you that have seen a baby right after birth and they look like cone heads, well, they do look like cone heads. Because these fontanelles are areas where the plates, where are able to slide past each other. So we had to go through all this problem, and we even had to invent a new kind of a hormone called relaxin that relaxes the ligaments in the female pelvis. Now, I'm going to stop right here, but before I do, I want to tell you something. When my wife told me she was pregnant, I said, oh, wonderful. And she and I sat down. She happens to be a midwife at the Cleveland Clinic, runs that department. So I said, I have an idea. We're going to do a little experiment. And what we're going to do, I just got a protractor, and I took her fingers, and I measured how far we could extend her fingers like this, right? And then when she was in labor, we were going to do it again to see how much the relaxin had released those ligaments. Good idea, right? Oh, no. Let me tell you, if a woman is in labor and you pull out a protractor, she's going to tell you where to put it. So it was a failed experiment. So here we are. We've got all these guys. We now have a lot of fossils. And what I want to just say is this. Homo erectus shows up at 1.8 million. And he then leaves Africa through the Levant, and he occupies, this is amazing, essentially 100,000 years, he's already in Asia. And maybe in Java in 1.8. So say he develops in Africa at 2 million. Look at that. That is amazing to me, how quickly he and she left Africa.
Is it possible that the growth of the brain is associated with the high-fat diet? For example, if you feeded a newborn chimp a high-fat diet, would their brain grow to larger size than normal for a chimp?
No, and the reason being is that whatever is triggering this, the glia is just insulation. But you've got to have all the neurons. And the neurons you pack on, and at birth you've got more neurons than you have. You lose them through cell death, programmed cell death. And then the rest of that is all glia. So you're not really, a chimp isn't going to change the number of neurons it has, even no matter what kind of high fat you put on. But, I mean, if we were to play the game, which you can't really do, if you were to take a chimp over 1,000 generations and give it more fat and selectively breed for it, you probably could. But I don't think you and I are going to be around to do that. One thing about the human brain, you have a minimum of 100 billion neurons. Each one of those neurons has a minimum of 1,000 connections. Isn't that amazing? Think of that. That is staggering. If we have time, maybe we'll talk about my view of the future, which is a big no-no in evolution.
Thank you for joining us. You've been watching Dr. Bruce Latimer discussing the development of ancient humans and their multiple migrations out of Africa. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Dr. Latimer will discuss the discovery of the Manot cave in northern Israel. Now, back to the talk.
This is just to show, again, it looks like there were at least probably 3 major migrations out of Africa, at least 2. First is Homo erectus. He takes off at 1.8 and shows up all over the old world. Still couldn't tolerate the really cold, although he was in Georgia, in Asia. I mean, pretty cold there. But he shows up early. Then what happens is, and we don't know if this was in situ in Europe and Asia and Africa, or it was a new migration. we have these guys. So I just threw them in. There are all sorts of names for these guys. I just threw them in the trash can taxon, which is called archaic Homo sapiens. What I want to say here, their brain is now in the human range, but their faces aren't. Look at those skulls. So you find these guys and they still have big brow ridges and big faces, and they don't have any chin. They have all these things, but their brain is within our range. So we kind of call them Homo sapiens and say that, archaic. Then, all of a sudden, because let's go to the Levant, we start finding guys that aren't quite archaic. They're beginning to look like what Scott talked about last time, Neanderthals. Now, what about these Neanderthals anyway? Where are they coming from? Well, I'm sure he told you that they're coming out of Europe. And they have a peculiar kind of a skull. And they show up around, the oldest ones are around 90,000. At the same time, we're finding what we call anatomically modern, which means they don't have those big giant faces, and they're developing chins, and they have big brains. In fact, this one, Kafka, it's from Israel, from a site in Israel. Its brain is bigger than our average. School 5 is also bigger than us. It's again, this modern anatomical human. And look at this guy. He's a Neanderthal, 1,700. I mean, that's a big brain. So they are not dumb people. And what it means is that we're getting Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coming up from the south and Neanderthals coming down from Europe, and they're bumping into each other. Well, actually, there's a huge debate on that. Maybe they weren't bumping into each other, but we now know genetically they were bumping into each other. That's a metaphor. So we find all up and down Israel, up and down the coast, all these caves, because Israel's limestone, and there's all these karstic caves, and they were utilizing these. So we've got Neanderthals and modern sapiens bumping into each other. We now know that there was genetic exchange. If you're not from Africa, you probably share 1% to 2% of your genetic material with Neanderthals. And how do you identify a Neanderthal versus a modern sapien? Well, they've got the big brow ridges. Everybody knows that. They have this thing on the back of their skull called an occipital bun. They also have no chin. They have a really big mandible, and they have something called a retromolar space, because the mandible's so big you could lay a pencil back there. They don't get impacted wisdom teeth like we do. And the shape of the skull is overall different. Ours is rounder and bigger on the top. Theirs is bigger on the bottom. Now, I'm sure you probably can't see that. These are just happen to say where we see modern Homo sapiens. And if you notice, the first ones are going to show up in Africa. And I would like to point out that the team that, he's not here today, but Johannes Haile Selassie has been instrumental in finding a lot of this stuff. If it's early, it goes back to earliest Homo sapiens, 160,000. But then it shows up in South Africa, School and Kafka, around 90,000. Interestingly, look at this. Look at Europe. Late, really late. So what were they doing? Now, this is when I was going to take questions. Guess I went a little slow. All right, let's get back. So the cave I told you was discovered purely by accident. And I want to show you what it looks like. It's a beautiful cave. It's an active cave with stalactites and stalagmites. That's what the original opening to the cave where the backhoe broke through the roof. It apparently, the original entrance to the cave had collapsed in a rock fall probably 20,000 years ago, and no one's been in since. And that means that the tools and the bones are absolutely pristine. And this is how you had to get into it. You know, when they first went down in this thing, they had to take aqua lungs, like a scuba tank, because there was no oxygen down there because it had been closed for all that time. My colleagues are insane. And on the first day, they found this. And we'll talk about this skull. It's a skull that was upside down on a shelf. It wasn't buried. Now here's what I want to ask you. The skull's been dated to 55,000 years old. It's in a cave that has been closed, as far as we can tell, for 18 to 20,000 years. What is it doing in the cave? If you know, let me know. So they did a survey. This is just how you had to get down. Kind of a rough way to get in there. That didn't work for us very well because it's, quite frankly, pretty dangerous. So we knocked an opening into the cave in a place where we thought was the original opening. Afraid we probably missed it. But it was a shot in the dark. So now you can go walk down into it. And I just want to give you some idea of what it looks like. It's a beautiful place to be. It's very wet, as you can imagine, slippery, very muddy. Beautiful features. So what's the environmental background in this whole area? Well, it's up in the mountains. If you triangulate in your mind, you are 2 miles from the Lebanese border. You can see the Lebanese border. And off to the left, you're 2 miles from the Mediterranean. And you're up high enough that you can look down and see the Mediterranean, which is very nice because you're in the mountains and there's a breeze coming off the sea all the time. It's a very, very nice place to work. And it's one of the few places in Israel that has a permanent water source. There aren't many. Boy, there really aren't many. So there's a creek that runs under it, so that they always had water. And that, of course, would have attracted animals. And these are just the places that we've excavated. I should tell you, I along with my colleague Israel Herskovitz, I'm a physical anthropologist. I want the bones. The archaeologists, on the other hand, I think they want job security. So they dig more slowly than anything you can imagine. You know, they get out their brushes and they get out their dental picks and and you know, we threaten, and we're going to threaten this year, we're getting a backhoe, folks. You know, we're going to go to a bobcat and find that skeleton in there. That's an ongoing battle. There's the skull. And these are the areas that we've been excavating. Now I was mentioning to somebody, because this thing is 7 stories deep, and as you go in the front door, it slopes down 7 floors. So everything's being carried down from water. So at the bottom of it, what we call Area C, the bottom of it is filled with artifacts, absolutely filled. Problem is, you don't have any context for them because they've all washed down. The cave is probably 80 degrees, 90 degrees. It's hotter than you would think. In order to get those buckets of dirt, which normally when you're working in a cave is the very worst thing. You know how much a bucket of dirt weighs? I mean, and you have to carry it up 7 stories. I mean, it's crazy. That's what graduate students are for, though. So my colleague, Israel, he figured out a way. He put together this thing that's like a ski lift. This is amazing. And as it goes by, you hook it on a hook and takes it up to the opening. Brilliant. Yeah, you can see that little thing there that's carrying the buckets. And then all the students get to go through the different stations. So they learn how to wet sieve, they learn how to dry sieve, they learn how to go through this stuff and pick through it so they can tell the difference between bone and rock, and they can tell a tool from a non-tool. So it's a great learning experience because they get to go through all these different things, these different stations. There's area C, where most of this stuff comes from. As I said, it really has no context, but boy, is it a rich place to dig. And we find, judging from the tools, we've got stuff from the Middle Paleolithic, which goes back to 250,000. So we've got some really old tools there. Then we also have Upper Paleolithic stuff that's a little less, it's from 45 on. So we find Mousterian tools, very primitive tools, and then we find things that are a bit more advanced. And we find these things, I'm not exaggerating, by the thousands. And because it's a pristine environment, students are still cutting their fingers on these rocks. You have to tell them, be careful. And I carry Band-Aids, because some student's going to come in and their finger's bleeding because they cut themselves on a tool that's, 100,000 years old. And this just shows, if you're an archaeologist, you like this kind of stuff. Me, I'm moving on. We also find bone and antler points. That's very important, because that is a transition where you start using bone and antlers to make points that you then haft onto a spear. We also find these. These come from the Mediterranean, and there are shells that they have drilled holes into, presumably to make a necklace, some kind of a body ornament. So we find a lot of these things too. Then you find lots of fauna. We know what these people were eating. They were eating red deer. And when I say they were eating red deer, they ate a lot of red deer. That's like all they ate. And they ate the young ones because we have so many of the bones. You can tell that they're preferentially going after young ones, probably because they taste better and they're easier to catch. But the big joke is, here's little Tommy, and Tommy says, Mom, what are we having for dinner? She says, red deer. You're like, please, can't we have something other than red deer every day? And then we've also got, when the people weren't there, they moved out, and that's when the hyenas moved in. And we even have a few bears that came in. Bears are long since gone from Israel, but during this point they were there, and the hyenas are gone too. So, once again, if you want to get out, you have to go through the Levant. And that's why Israel's been called the bus stop of human evolution. You got to go through it.
Before you made a comment that everybody came out of Africa. But then after that, a few more sentences down the line, you said the Neanderthals came down and merged with the people coming out of Africa. Well, I thought everybody came out of Africa, so where did the Neanderthals come from?
Well, the Neanderthals, what led to the European Neanderthal came out of Africa too. So that, their ancestors came out of Africa too. So we've got the Homo erectus coming out at 2 million, and then probably another invasion into Europe and Asia. Who knows when, 600, maybe 800, and then another one at 60,000. But modern Homo sapiens, meaning everyone in this room, came out of Africa 60,000 years ago. So we all come from Africa. And another thing about this, I really do think that every third grader, fourth grader, fifth grader should be taught why our skin color is different. I really do. Because if you don't have a scientific explanation for it, what are you going to do when little Tommy goes home and says, Mom, my best friend has a different skin color than I have? Why? Well, she doesn't know. So she makes up a story. I'm not even going to talk about the different stories about it, but they make up a story. It's really quite simple, people, if you don't know. If you live on the equator, there's too much UV light, and at that point, it breaks down your folic acid through your skin. And if you don't get enough folic acid, then you end up with terrible problems in your neural tube in embryology, spina bifida and all kinds of things. But when you move away from Africa, then all of a sudden it gets cooler and you start putting on clothing and you don't get enough sun because you don't develop enough vitamin D because if you don't have vitamin D, then what happens? You can't process calcium because it won't cross your gut, and then you end up with rickets. And rickets are bad because they cause your pelvis to deform, and then you die in childbirth. So it's an easy thing to explain skin color. Let's just not make up any more stories. You know, so that's why I say that.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Dr. Bruce Latimer. Dr. Latimer is a former curator of the Laboratory of Physical Anthropology and past director of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. In the second part of our talk, we learned about the Manot Cave and some of the first evidence of early hominin occupation. In our final segment, Dr. Latimer will discuss the early human skull discovered in the Manot Cave. Now, back to our talk.
Okay, I just like to see this guy is down there pointing to the ledge where the skull came from. That's what it looks like. Now, it ain't much, but it is old. And it does fall within the human range for brain size. It's a little on the small side, but it is a small person. My guess is it's a middle-aged female, although there's no way to tell. But you know, in paleontology, there's a demon. And the demon has a little ball-peen hammer, and he breaks fossils in just the place you want to know. Well, this has no brow ridge. We needed a brow ridge. No brow ridge, sorry. So we had to look elsewhere. Did it have an occipital bun, that bun on the back of your head, which a Neanderthal has? Well, yeah, it does. It does. It's not like a Neanderthal, but it does have a slight occipital bun. However, the shape of the skull is not like a Neanderthal. Its broadest area is high, up here in the parietals. If you look at a Neanderthal, it's low, down here. Now, I'm not getting into the weeds on this, but there's something called a suprailiac fossa, which I'm told Scott told you about. Well, a suprailiac fossa is a Neanderthal, some Neanderthals, not all, they have it, but this Manot 1 has it, but it's a totally different style, a totally different shape. So that what we see is that we have a skull that has these modern characteristics. It's kind of an odd mixture, but it does have modern characteristics. If you look at the top, this is the modern human on the top. That's our skull. Look how flat it is. It's very flat. It's like somebody stood it on its head. And it has something called a ridge along the coronal suture, which is elevated up here. So when we take a look at this thing, it has this odd mixture of Neanderthals, which is this guy, modern human, and what we see is it slopes here more than most modern humans. That's that keel. That's the occipital bun. So it is an odd mixture. But I would say, and we had to decide on this, what are we going to call it? So we said well, I do think it's not a Neanderthal. It's a modern Homo sapien. Just more kind of measurements that we took, trying to figure out what this thing was and what it looks like. Well, that's a Neanderthal, and Neanderthals have a peculiar shaped skull. It's very long and narrow, and has a funny shape from the back. Not so in this guy. He looks more like the modern human here. Oh my God. Well, so here's what you had to think. Is Manot 1 inbreeding with local Neanderthals? Remember, it's 55,000, so it's dead on that plane, dead on that time scene when the Neanderthals are hanging out there too. So you've got Neanderthals in the same place as you've got Manot, and I'm sure they bumped into each other. So could this be a cross between Neanderthals and modern humans? Don't know. We couldn't get any protein out of it. It's so highly mineralized, so we couldn't do a DNA analysis. We have teeth, and we hope maybe we'll pull something out of the teeth. We couldn't get it from the skull, so we don't know. And you know what's more? I don't know what a hybrid between a Neanderthal and an anatomically modern human would look like. I have no idea. This has a little kind of primitive things, but so Now, could it be along with the skull and Kafka? Skull and Kafka are in the Levant, and they were down there 90,000. And they look modern human. I'll admit, they have the big brains, and they look really big brains, and they look like modern humans. They even have a chin. Problem is, we don't see them in Europe. They apparently got to Israel, hung around for a while, but never went any further. Because remember, the first modern human in Europe shows up at 45,000. So these guys, I don't know what happened to Skull and Kafka, but they didn't seem to hang around. They must have retreated back, I don't know. So we had to say, could this be at 55,000 a continuation of those guys at 90,000? I doubt it. That's too much time. Now, just quickly, there are two basic ideas. There's something called the regional continuity model, which just means that when Homo erectus left at 1.8, went to Asia, went to Europe, went all over the old world, they maintained enough gene flow so you didn't get any speciation event. That's from some guy from the University of Michigan, a guy named Milford Wolpoff. Big proponent of this. The other one is the replacement model. And that says, no, that didn't happen. What happened is Homo sapiens left Africa and took over. You know, they left Africa and they just took over. And what they do with the Homo erectus they bumped into? What they do with the Neanderthals they bumped into? Well, with the Neanderthals, we know they bumped into them a little. But I think my guess is that's why Neanderthals aren't around today. Now I want to talk about a Duma, because this is a skull that was, you notice who the first author here is Haile Selassie. The Duma skull is the oldest modern human skull we have from Africa at 160,000. So our species starts out at about 160,000. Probably a little older, push it back to 180. Here's another skull, Herto, which also comes from roughly the same area as the Duma skull, and it also, brain size the same as ours, about 160,000. So we see modern humans are showing up in Africa early. So let's look at the replacement model, and I'm just going to go through this so fast. We, meaning Homo sapiens, shows up sometime at around 200,000 in Africa, in East Africa. Then they migrated out of East Africa around 60,000. That's what the fossil evidence tells us. That's what everything seems to be pointing to. And that means that they ran into the Neanderthals in the Levant, in Israel. So the Neanderthals, as Scott told you, went extinct about 40,000. Pretty good evidence of that. And that means that these guys were in the Levant at about 50,000, 55,000. So they had time to bump into each other. And they no doubt did. So what are the conclusions here that we can draw? Well, we don't have a lot, but I'm going to tell you we do have more. We have several foot bones, we have a manubrium, we have several teeth that again are washing out of a grave somewhere. We just haven't hit the grave. So we know we've got a young individual, probably 16 years old, in terms of its maturation of its bones. We have a couple young kids because we have their deciduous molars, and we probably have another adult. Now, those are things that have been washing out. As I told you, that's why we get so angry with the archaeologists. It's like, yeah, we like tools. You have 1,000 tools here. We have 10,000 tools. Move on. You know, keep going, guys. Well, it's a big cave and we haven't hit it yet, but we will. Cross your fingers. This July, we're going to find it. So what can we say? Well, it goes all the way back to about 250,000, judging from the tools. That means if we hit something, it's going to be important. Then we also have Upper Paleolithic from 45 to about 22. So we run the whole gamut, and you can see it with all the tools. As I said, the original entrance was blocked I don't think we found the original entrance. I think we're close to it because we have hearths, we have fire pits. And you don't, in a cave, you don't build a fire pit very deep in there because you'll kill yourself with the smoke. So you've got to stay close to the entrance. So we're probably pretty close. And looking over this thing, we decided that we think it's anatomically modern human. It's a little strange, I admit. It's with that occipital bun and that suprailiac fossa. It's got things that are archaic, things that are kind of primitive. But overall, it's a modern human in terms of the shape of it and the terms of its morphology. Thanks very much.
This lecture is part of the Origins Science Scholars Program of the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and IdeaStream. It has been brought to you with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's College of Arts and Sciences, Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origins Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.